you know, the RSA has the expressed desire to bring us into 21st century enlightenment. And I have been asking members or fellows of the RSA what they think 21st century enlightenment is, because I really don't think anyone in the upper echelons of the RSA has the faintest clue what 21st century enlightenment is. And you know, so it's actually a very interesting thing. It's part of the modern age to have some sort of banner.
Yeah, it's a PR.
That sort of says we are about.
Yes.
And the RSA says we are about 21st century enlightenment.
Yes, so you can play that.
Can you claim to be about 21st century enlightenment without knowing what 21st century enlightenment, or having any idea about what 21st century enlightenment is, and in particular how 21st century enlightenment might be moving us on from 18th century enlightenment? So, you know, so as soon as you talk about it, the enlightenment, you know, there are huge numbers of issues that arise, you know. I mean, there is Buddhist enlightenment, there is 18th century enlightenment. So what do we really mean by enlightenment? And how does one bring this about? Because the very idea of enlightenment is that you're actually inspiring some sort of cultural movement out of a previous pattern of thought into a new pattern of thought. And how do you do that unless you are aware of what the previous pattern of thought is and how it's restrictive, and what a future pattern of thought might be, and how that moves us on.
What they are actually saying in the subtext, which is a sort of new Labour agenda, but
given the chief executive, I want to use the context.
but I don't think, the point that you're making is that they need to be pushed a lot harder. Yeah.
Well, if it is a new Labour agenda, then you know that's an issue, isn't it? Because that's framing it purely politically. And what you're actually asking for fundamentally is a shift in philosophy, a shift in psychology, and above all, underlying that, there has to be a shift in perception. And to me, that's what the issue is. It's about how do you shift us out of an existing, extraordinarily dominant perception of reality that has proved to lead to all sorts of psychological, environmental, and social difficulty. How do we shift out of that into actually something which is more realistic? I mean, the 18th century Enlightenment was about becoming more realistic and breaking faith with authoritarianism of the past and dogmatism of the past, and yet it introduced its own dogmatism. And so it's again, so we might be asking the question, well, so how do we shift out of the dogmatism that was in the 18th century Enlightenment, and into something which is actually, again, more realistic, and that requires us to ask, you know, what is reality? And even this morning there was someone on the Today programme talking about quantum mechanics, and how quantum mechanics is telling us that our idea of reality is quite wrong, but we don't know why or how it's wrong. You know, because essentially quantum mechanics is telling us things that, you know, most ordinary people, you know, with ordinary backgrounds can't possibly understand. Why can't they understand? So I think that I think there are issues, and again, I'm speaking quite strongly now, but for myself, I see that that actually there is a very obvious way of viewing the world, which most of us probably see that reality as children, and then we have it knocked out of us. And so it's almost a question of, you know, how can we accept what is in some sense blindingly obvious.
Except that things rarely are blindingly obvious. I mean, the trouble is, it's blindingly obvious to us because everything that we have lived everything we have lived and known until that point, we make sense of the world. So for us it is. But then you suddenly come across somebody else from a different culture or a different part of the world, and everything you say is meaningless. And so the question is, is anything blindingly obvious, or is this actually the real problem, which is that we don't communicate enough, we don't understand because the words we use and the way we express them, they don't mean the same thing to both of us, or anyone you're talking to. And what we keep on ducking is this idea of somehow coming together and entering a dialogue so we both understand from what we're saying the same thing, or as close to it as we can both agree, because then you can move. But unless we sort of think, well, you must be stupid if you don't understand that because it's obvious, and then the other person can quietly say to themselves, yes, it's obvious to me that it's crazy. And so the point is, I think it's about language and how we engage with things and the willingness to not hold on to what we believe in or we think is so self-evident and obvious, to let it go for a bit, to let somebody else in, and hear what they say. Because if it is so obvious and self-evident, then just listening to them, it allows them to speak and express their point of view, but it also allows you to understand where it might be possible to say to them, oh, if this means that to you, and it means this to me, what's the difference? Where are we disagreeing? Where in this is there this difference of opinion, which seems obvious but clearly isn't, because we both have different understandings. So I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that the territory we're in, the majority of science believes it knows what it does. I think the vast majority of the population accepts it, but it doesn't understand it. And then there are a group who definitely think it's wrong, but the language they're using is completely wrong for both. Somehow in all of this, it's not that it's wrong. In other words, we're beginning to use language in a very specific way, or words in a specific way that don't have a general meaning. And I think if we want to have an influence, then what you have to do is you have to find a way of listening more and then sort of allowing it to develop rather than imposing it. Because I think, to me, this is what natural inclusionality is all about, that if we're in difference, then I need to be inclusive. I need to find a way of bringing you into it, which doesn't hurt you, even though I might, in the process, be a little bit hurt myself. But then that allows me to respond, and the response should be at an emotional level, because people get emotional, and they don't know they do, but they do. And when you are hurt by something, they will know it, and that can change then how they present it and push it. So I think there's an awful lot here. I mean, that's why I said early on, what I would prefer that is first-person experiences from this, because this is, I think, the only way we can begin to uncover exactly what's going on here, because somebody else listening to you tell your story, for instance, or somebody would say, well, hang on a minute, maybe that bit was a little bit this. So in other words, here we have 5 views, and they won't all be the same, and the question is, where do they differ? And is that difference something we could use? Being aware of it, we would learn how to then do that.
I think the point that I'm drawing together from what Alan has said and what you've said is that, as we know, the issue of first-person perception is not acknowledged in the scientific community, and almost over-acknowledged in the artistic community. To that end, what I thought was very interesting about this essay series was the use of the word data, which they used very peremptorily, like that's what we've done, and this is why this is right, because it's got data.
Galileo.
Well, my data is, you know, my own personal experiences, but they were allowed. I think it's a great word to use, and I have no idea why data isn't considered scientific. Has it just been sort of eaten up by marketing companies?
Data.
No, personal experience.
Personal experience.
Not
Personal experience.
Yeah, but that's how we develop
But they define
our
data
own,
in a
our
different
own,
way.
our
Yeah,
own.
but they define data in a different way because our experience often isn't quantifiable or measurable. It's our experience and how we take that. And to
Yes.
turn that into data would be quite difficult.
But what I'm saying is the essays that we've had published, the justification for those, they're very clearly coming from first person. And this is why in a way they are quite radical, that the word data was mentioned, but my essay in particular was from my experience as a human being and as a painter.
Can I maybe sort of jump in just with a few thoughts, picking up from what Alan said? When we talk about things like the RSA being about 21st Enlightenment, and the thought that came to my mind at that point is they can't know, and they won't know until others look back in time. And I think there is something here that we're getting really caught in, ironically, the linear mechanistic paradigm. So even by asking the question, how can we get these concepts more integrated, what we're assuming is that we can do something to make that happen. And what I've come to realize increasingly in my life and my work is that I actually can't make anything happen. What I can do is be me and be true in any particular moment, and to offer something that comes through me in that moment, and then to surrender. So getting really holding that dance of it isn't about leadership and followership. It isn't about you being leader and me being follower, because that locks us into a kind of psyche and a label that actually isn't true to the dance of receptive space, responsive energy. And if we're in that dance, then actually none of us can make anything happen in a pushing way. Now in your earnestness, Alan, you were kind of getting drawn into that pushing, and yet I've heard you use the words about receptive space, invokes, induces. It's not about thrusting male energy. It's about holding, showing up, opening and holding the space. And if people don't come into it, they don't come into it. They're not ready. They haven't arrived. If people do come into it, it's how do we engage with them in that space? Knowing that if my offer is to open the space and somebody enters, then in each act that is simultaneously a leader and a follower. And so we can't know what the next step will be. So we can't answer the question, how can we get these concepts more integrated? What we can do is take a step and offer a hand. And if the hand is taken, then, okay, who knows what that next thing will be? And it was interesting. I've been attempting to write a chapter for a book in a coaching supervision book. So it's a field that is very new. It's in an emergence stage, and in the process of writing that, what I'm introducing is natural inclusion and this whole notion of receptive space, responsive energy, and how in some of the work that I'm doing, which is held within my doctoral writing, and inevitably following words and coming across influence and the origins of it. It's influere, in flow. And at some point in the, I can't even remember the century now, but something like between the 13th and 17th century, that changed from being influence to influence. So it's directly opposite to its original meaning. And so there's something for me about how do we and I actually came across several words where the original, they've either gone out of, the words have become so-called obsolete, and I'm finding myself, well, they're not obsolete to me. Like there's this word informing, not informing, but informing. What a perfect word for responsive energy and creating that kind of our materiality in this time. And so I think for me, if the paradox is that for this to be accepted, that first acceptance has to be so deeply embodied in us, and to be able to be it even when we may find ourselves day in, day out surrounded by people who are not experiencing what we're experiencing. But to find these moments of what is the word? Family, collegiality, attunement.
Companionship.
Yeah. And just, oh, okay, I am not alone. And catching ourselves in the way we speak, that we, and you talked about relationality and dialogue, and yes, it is about that. And there is that part where in my relationality, I have to always be centering in on myself. So that first conversation is me. And how am I framing and how am I thinking?
But that's this whole thing about authenticity, isn't it?
But
you can't do it if you're not authentic.
Yeah, but we also can't do the relationality bit if there's that internal battle in us. And that's really when my kind of starting point in my adult life has been, is because I simply couldn't do the relational bit because I was in such a mess internally. And I actually had to do that internal work to be able to find that way. And so that idea of the cosmos centering in on itself and therefore expanding, to me, is what I think is central to this whole notion of natural inclusion, that receptive, responsive space, and you're there being receptive, responsive, and I am, and you are, and so we're all centering in on ourselves, but developing our capacity to relate to each other because of that attunement, that coherence that we have within.
It's sort of interesting you mentioned that period, because my understanding was that it was the rise of Christianity, because before then people very much, it was about the soul and the inward journey, but Christianity turned it into no, it's about God. And you have, in a sense, so it turned it from an inward reflection to an outward, that God can do all of this and you can't. And that's where the switch occurred, because and then now Christianity is falling down because materialism is taking over. So suddenly this doesn't work anymore, but what on earth does?
Yeah. And it's funny, there's something, because I don't know about that history, because that's not my starting point. My starting point is here, is what do I know from in here? And I think when you said about people won't know about what the 21st century like will be, they don't know the answer. Actually, I don't agree, because to know that is to be brought back into our heads, to be drawing on knowledge that's encrusted in words, in books, most of which we'll never ever read, and there's something fundamentally in us that I think everybody can access, and it goes back to us being kids.
Yes.
I mean, and the work that I'm doing is passing on a way of working, a way of being, and kids get away with that. They don't need to know about the 18th and 19th, because they're drawing on themselves. And if we get that bit then, boy, I think the ripples will occur, but not because we've tried to make the ripples go. It's because we're simply trying to be in attunement with what is going on here and how does that fit relationally in the context of the wider world.
I mean, you're pushing against enormous social conditioning because science has had the upper hand for quite a few years. And actually, I mean, I would disagree and say that whatever the new reality or whatever this new phenomenon will be began in the 1920s because quantum physics began to undermine the Cartesian Newtonian view of the world, but nobody found anything to put in place because they were confronted with a dilemma. There was nothing obvious out of it. They were in no man's land, and that's actually still where they are because they cannot let go of this. Well, it must be right because nobody can prove that there's something other than that.
And who is they?
Well, science. Well, that's right. And this is the crazy part about it. Because
in
individuals
the moment,
hold both views.
Yeah, and in the moment you say they, you make other.
Yeah.
And so there's the start of the separation. So how do we get beyond that?
No, well, I think you have to, in a sense, you have to acknowledge that there is a difference, and that there is a difference in point of view, and that in a sense, so when I say they, for me, that's not directed to anyone in particular, but that is that there is a body of thought which expresses that, and I acknowledge that, but then how I engage with that would be quite different, and I think if you don't acknowledge it, that's okay, I don't mind that, but there is a reality that most people have to live with, where this has a very, very stark reality to it, and one that diminishes them considerably. And what I don't want is people to feel diminished by it. I want them to, how do I create? And I can do that personally, and I do that in the work that I do. But the point is I still have to recognise, and I'm quite happy, it'll take me as long as it's going to take. And I don't have any ideas about how to change it tomorrow, because I don't want to be this, again, it's back to this leaders. Everyone now is looking around for somebody to tell them, no, you need to find this within yourself. And that's the point, and that's the real crunch, is that they're so conditioned to being told what to do so that they can understand where they're going. They don't realise this is a journey where there is no destination, because the destination is whatever you want it to be.
However, there is an other. There is the other does exist, and we have things are set up as they are, and our personal inner workings and inner relationship. It's a magnificent process that you were discussing, but there's a social emergency going on, which is almost unaddressable. Is almost so chaotic that there seems to be no way to sort of to pierce through with actually something that's a twist in reality, and from that point of view, I think that we are forced to acknowledge that we have our personhood to look after, but there's a government out there. We can ask for the world to sort of flow, and we can hope that it will happen. I can pretty much guarantee you that it won't. I personally think that the need for, I mean, you said it was a male energy of pushing, thrusting. How to be that horrible, but you know, if one traces back to science and that rise, how has that happened? That's an incredible dominance, and now our abandonment to technology, regardless of the consequences to humanity, which is extraordinary. You read daily in the rags that humanity could be obsolete. Why are we doing that? Sorry?
Just pick up this, you know, how did this sort of happen? And if you sort of think about it, not only is this sort of a male point of view, but they established it by making sure that the women could not be educated, would not be educated, because they were at home, they were the provider, and were doing the tough jobs, but also they were doing the intellectual jobs. And education and knowledge for women was withheld for years. And if you think about, if you go back in years, I mean, the woman had a very important place in villages and in the communities because of the qualities that they offered in opposition, if you like, to the men. And particularly when, you know, if there were wars, then the women would look after the men, and it would be much more equitable. But all of a sudden, you start reducing the education and reducing them. I mean, that's what I find the most appalling part about it, is that not only did you, I mean, they actively, as part of a clear way forward, that we don't want women in here because they would object to what we're doing.
Yeah.
And it became entirely inhumane, and not just to other humans, but actually to the planet. So it got beyond.
Is that being addressed inside of?
No.
No.
Not at all.
Not
Well,
inside of
the
Royal
worst part of it
Society.
is, you look at the female politicians now, and don't they exhibit male characteristics? They don't listen.
Sure.
And they know, because that's how they have to survive in that world. And it's corrupt. In fact, I can't think of a single profession or business these days which isn't corrupted by power and other material.
But I do think, in terms of inclusion, it's critical to take that on board.
But inclusion is happening at a lower level.
So rather than to resist that and say, to say it's not, you know, we don't want to be corrupt, we want to be purist, to actually acknowledge those problems in the system, and to realise that there could be a better way. I mean, this is to my mind so abstracted, because I think I actually don't know the history of a place like the Royal Society. Like how has that all managed to happen, where the Royal Society has managed to have such a critical role? I mean,
the question is, does it have a critical role?
Science.
And I'm not sure that it does. I think it was an influential, and basically it's as you would expect. Men met together in coffee houses, and then from that they decided to create a place where they could meet, and that was because coffee houses wasn't. And then these people became very, it's like all of the societies, and in fact almost all the societies were male dominated. And then, you know, the inclusion of women began to take place, I think, in the last century. And so it begins to move. But
maybe that's part of the answer. A society, we need to have our own.
I wrote it yesterday. I mean, lots of people say, "Oh, Alan, your thoughts are so complicated." Even
So
Rex
what?
said it was like intellectual spaghetti, and this, that, and the other.
So
And
what?
you know,
Was Newton easy?
yeah. But actually, the reality that I'm speaking of is extraordinarily simple, and I'll state it now. There are two primary, irreducible presences in nature: space and energy. Together, in mutually inclusive, receptive, responsive relationship, they co-create everything in all its diversity. That is a very simple statement of an understanding of natural inclusion. And it is very simple. Two presences which together, in a receptive, responsive relationship with one another, co-create everything.
And what if you
So,
if
you know, so what is difficult
can I just
about
can I
that
just
as a
stop you
basic,
mid-flow?
simple
I just want to stop
statement?
you mid-flow. If you were talking to the Royal Society, not as Alan Rayner, natural inclusionist, but as Alan Rayner, paid up materialist, how would that sentence sound from
What, to members of the Royal Society?
Yeah.
Fellows of the Royal Society?
so what is the current
Well, I mean, the current kind of doctrine is that, and the fallacy that we're all stuck with is that matter and space, the material and the immaterial, are mutually exclusive, that they're isolated from one another. And that essentially goes right back to Descartes, which was, and Descartes, of course, went right back to Aristotle and Plato, and Aristotle and Plato, you know, and so on and so forth. It goes back a very, very long way. But essentially, when you isolate the material from the immaterial and essentially split them apart, and this is the mind-matter dualism and all these kinds of ideas, when you do that, you actually create a non-reality. But you then try to live and practice according to that non-reality. You're essentially living a lie and living in paradox. And it is living in that lie and living in that paradox that produces lovelessness, conflict, and an enormous confusion.
you can immediately see all the emotional and psychological and
Yes.
political spin-offs,
Yes, I mean, because what it's almost
that
immediately done
root difference.
is it as I mean, in a very fundamental sense, is it has isolated the self as a block of matter from the self's context, from the self's neighbourhood, as the space that we naturally included in. I mean, I wrote something this morning which is a little bit along these lines, and it is to do with this fundamental issue of objectivity. You know, the Royal Society is the enshrinement of objectivity, and science as it is currently practiced is the enshrinement of objectivity. Here is something what I wrote this morning, just before getting on the train. I said, objectivity arises from subjectively setting yourself apart from what you are included within.
Yes.
It creates paradox and lovelessness and conflict, not realistic perception. So, and that is actually what we're trapped in, is a way of thinking, a perception, which is clearly false. And it becomes clearly false as soon as you allow your perception to come from all orientations, inside to outside and outside to inside, and not just be a perception that comes from standing apart from what you're observing. And that's really the fundamental problem in quantum mechanics, is quantum mechanics cannot be understood objectively, but because the formalism of quantum mechanics and the mathematics of quantum mechanics is all about setting the self apart from the neighborhood, you essentially get very, very paradoxical statements coming through. Says, you know, oh, two things can be in the, can be in the, two different things can be in the same place at the same time, and all those kinds of difficult ideas that are associated with quantum mechanics. When all quantum mechanics is telling you is that if you split the intangible reality from tangible reality, you'll make a nonsense of everything. And that's essentially what it's telling us. And that is why quantum mechanics itself sounds like nonsense, because people are trying to describe quantum mechanics in objectivistic terms, and you can't do so. If you start to understand quantum mechanics in relational terms, in terms of receptive responsive relationship, then it all makes sense. And as soon as you include the intangible aspect of reality within and all around the tangible aspect, then all the scientific findings actually start to make a great deal of sense. But we are stuck with a way of thinking, a form of perception, a conception, and this brings us to the difference between concept and percept. You know, percept is how you perceive reality. Concept is what you make up as an idea.
And many
Yes.
times we
And so,
Yeah.
so Rex, you were talking about perception and that being dogged, and you were talking about.
Yes, and in a way, see, there's the paradox that people speak of, you see, is I'm being thrusting I'm being thrusting in putting forward a way of a perception which is actually all about true influence. So, you know, but because, again, power and influence have got synonymized in an objectivistic way,
Yes, yes.
we have lost the understanding that influence is invitational.
Yes.
And so it is about sort of drawing in, about welcoming in, about sharing. It's all about this fundamental dynamic of the universe, which is about opening up, drawing in, and passing on. So it is a kind of acceptance, caring, outgoing aspect of, and that is actually how we are as human beings, but not how we allow ourselves to be in terms of governance. And I'm quite keen if Rachel will say a word here, because Rachel's experience, to my mind, is really crucial to an understanding of how the objectification of the other, leads to conflict, and the effect that it had on her personally. I mean, I don't know if you want to say something, Rachel, at this point.
So I was starting to get into this. Why am I here? As I'm hearing our lovely conversation. And why am I here? Because I want something different. And that's what I discovered when I came across natural inclusion. It was something, a way for me to be different in the world. And in experiencing that, in the receiving of the awareness, gave me a new hope that I was no longer to live in isolation, but then to understand and to integrate that new awareness requires conversations like this so that they can be received and shaped. So I will be shaped by our conversation here today, and I will be different when I leave, because I have become open to this awareness of natural inclusion that has influence in a co-creative way instead of a power over forceful, informative way. So it's the end, as you say, the end forming, not informing. And it came to me why I have no connection with the RSA whatsoever. And I came across what I thought was an idea of natural inclusion through a video that I'd heard seen Alan present, and suddenly something clicked at an intellectual level, then followed not very much of his work to then discover this was the painting that then made a huge difference for me, this one, but then understood receptive, responsive. And it was as if I was in I'd gone through the veil and I was in the territory where there was no map. So therefore I had to engage to create a map in the moment with whoever was there. So I needed to have a new perception of who I was, so that which is then about, you were saying, you know, about starting from that own heart self, then straight from that to enable me to engage with the world from a new perception that enabled me to feel more alive. That feeling of more aliveness included the vitality of the intangible that had been abstracted through the historical exclusion of nature through the intellectualization of concepts.
Would you want to say a little bit about your personal background? Because I find that extremely interesting. And I also think I find one of your great ambitions for 2018 also very interesting.
Well, I feel that we're at a critical point in history, this being 2018, which is the anniversary, centenary of the end of the First World War.
Sorry, it's pretty
Okay.
distracting.
That's quite a good point at which to... Oh, right, okay.
And the reason that my personal involvement in this was that I served in the First Gulf War in 1991, and as a member of the Royal Air Force, a commissioned officer of the Royal Air Force, and found myself stuck in a bunker where we were expecting nuclear, chemical and biological weapons. That in itself, as an experience, is something that all military people are trained for. They accept that as a given. It's a part of a threat. It's part of a, okay, that's going to happen. But something else was happening as well. For me, was that I had very loving parents sitting at home, and my father had a heart attack. And in the middle of the war, I was sent home, which again was unusual. But there was a moment where I walked into a hospital ward back in the UK after I'd been flown back from Bahrain, and when I saw my father, there was a connection of it was as if a ticker tape ran between us that said you're alive, because he thought I might have been dead and I thought he might have been dead. So for a long time, it took us a long time between us to be able to have conversations, to articulate what we were saying. But it was this heart space that he'd physically had, and then it led us down quite wonder-filled sort of explorations to places like Glastonbury, and going on dancing courses and all sorts of things that we could call the New Age spirituality that we would explore together. But we never really got to the bottom of it between us. But there was this connection that I've always wanted to feel, to understand more. It wasn't until I came across natural inclusion that suddenly the answer was there about this receptive responsive space. And when my parents both came to live with me in their later years, in 18 months my father died, and there was this explosion of energy that sort of left me, as there was this fear of him dying had gone. But just before we would talk before he died, I would speak to him and say, hey, what was it like for you when I was little? And he said, it was only 2 years ago that he said, do you know what it was like? He said it was like watching a video game when your daughter was the target. So if you go back to 1990, mobile phones were still, we hadn't got all of that going on. And so it was a new way of really being able to integrate and live again, which is, death of a loved one is an inevitable part of life. And what's been enormously helpful is when Alan and I have had conversations and I can say things because I mentioned in an email, my mother died 2 weeks ago, and she got dementia, and to say to Alan, you know, this is cruel, this is really cruel, and Alan said to me, nature's not cruel, nature just is. So to be able to have this composure in the face of the two amazing human beings that brought me up with loving kindness, and to allow them to go and continue that with hope for humanity. What I feel very strongly through this understanding of natural inclusion is this thing about locality and territorial and territoriality that we've had not that many discussions about, but there's an emerging understanding that's coming between us that there's nothing wrong with conflict in a local protective area, but war is an abstract concept. So my question that I'm holding is, through an awareness of natural inclusion, is it possible to make war obsolete? And if so, what would the world look like?
And really, what greater honour could be bestowed upon the fallen than to make war obsolete? The Great War was supposed to be the war that ended all wars, and it did nothing of the sort.
But I think what
and
was...
why was that? Why did that happen?
But what was interesting in our discussions was and I think it then answering your question about the experience of when somebody gets natural inclusion, it just came in a moment of a conversation between Alan and I. It was just one moment. And that one moment, there was a depth of understanding through which only through time and conversation the understanding would emerge in a bigger context. But it was that moment of receptive, responsive energy was a turning point in my life.
Interesting for me, talking about those first moments. But first of all, thank you for talking about your mum and your dad. So it's very strange to me to be here with having lost my dad last week.
It felt that there was some, having met before, it felt as if there was this
Yet another
amazing
synchronicity.
synchronicity, and I think when one is tuned into natural inclusion, these synchronous events happen, and that's how the emergence will flow that will come from a heart connection, not a head connection.
And you talking about your coming to know natural inclusion as a concept that made sense for you of something that you already had in you came for me. So there I am in the academic arena thinking that I'm going to be doing something that will allow me to stretch into systemic ways of being, and then being confronted by the academic convention. And in that struggle, I had to make a choice in getting through my first year's report to get permission to continue, was, do I play the game, or do I find a way to do it that is, for me, honouring and not compromising on what seems right? And I chose to go for finding a way where I could do it authentically and coherently, and knowing that that might mean I don't get it. It might mean I fail in those terms. But so once I had made that decision, I then was exploring for how do I articulate, how do I write, how do I express this? And I couldn't find in the academic literature a way to honour what I was grasping for. So I made a word up. And the word I made up was to try to grasp the different ways of expressing that I was finding myself being, a kind of being doing. And I called my 4 ways state waves. Because I knew, drawing on this kind of the particle wave notion, it wasn't an it, and it wasn't just a flow. It was an embodiment of something. And so I'd settled into that, and I found the notion of metalog from Gregory Bateson, and then I was directed to Jack Whitehead's work, and then I found the word flow form, and I thought, oh my God, there's somebody who's... So flow form, state wave, and that was the point at which we reached, and for me that was like a coming home. It's like, okay, now I have a reference. And then through this group, accessing Polanyi's work, where there's such strong resonance in what he talks about and in what I'm doing. And that thing you were saying, Dee, about the subjectivity, for me that is the central point of bringing together everything I'm doing in my research. And if I get it, that'll be wonderful. And if I don't, I won't have failed. I will just put markers.
And again, I'm drawing back to coming to practical outcomes, because that just aggravates me so much that you as somebody who's putting their heart and all into a piece and publication with a purity and a deep understanding, would then have to be in that position where you're likely to fail.
I'm not likely to
But you were likely
you
to
were.
fail.
You were.
Yeah.
You put yourself on that line.
Yes, before
But that's
yeah,
true.
we're set
That is
over that.
It's right, fail. You're not going to die, are you? Through it, and that I think is the difficulty with the academic thing, and the trauma that it puts people through.
the kind of existential threat.
And
Yes.
it is an existential threat
Yes.
that then denies the individual creativity to be able to and this is why I think that children do get it so if so soon, because they haven't been oppressed so early. And it's, I think what I'd love to see is a new educational foundation that comes out of this, and that's
the critical thing. It
That's
has to
what
begin
I
with
would-
education.
I would just love to be part of a new educational foundation where we can start from these principles, the perceptions, and to allow, if it starts at this, with this, crafting of our language, so that we use language of influence, not force, and to almost get a new glossary, so that we can, not so that we have an ideal shared understanding of the same word, but an embodied expression of that word and those influences, so that we can nurture and support one another's creativity, instead of feeling threatened that as soon as a piece of creativity comes out, it's then threatened.
I mean, what fascinates me is some years ago, one of the things that somebody said, would I come to, was a talk on mediated learning, which was Reuben Forstein's work. He's an Israeli teacher, and it was exactly that actually you don't tell the child anything, but what you do is you allow the child to discover for themselves all of the bits, and it was, I found that very inspiring because it's very hands-off, and it's very much like the Steiner and Montessori methodology. And what amazes me is that the only reason I think it can't be accepted is because you can't put a standard or a quality or something. Actually what's happening is the child is developing at such a phenomenal rate across a range of things, you can't pin them to anything. But what you get out of it is a child which is incredibly creative and completely open, less judgmental about things, and much more prepared to walk into uncertainty and just experience it and then make sense of it. Whereas instead you get a clone that can't move and doesn't know what to do because nobody's told them what to do, and they expect to be told what to do, or this is what you do, and that's
where I hope that I would like to, and wonder if it would
Hello?
We got you! Finally!
whether it would ever be possible to use that experience
Hi.
of going to war.
Hi.
Hi.
Come
The
join.
threshold is around there.
We're right in the
I
middle.
can certainly, I mean, I can echo because the first time I went into combat was in Sarawak, which is commando unit.
We cannot see you.
And
Can you see? Sorry.
it
just
took
hang on,
14
hang on a
days
sec,
to
right.
get to the location.
Um,
And we discovered when we got there that we were on the limits of the artillery backup and that the enemy was 4 times stronger than we were, which was not odds considered good. And we were in trees that night. We used hammocks to stop giving away that we'd been there. I've never felt so frightened the night before the action. You know, because you just felt a knife in your back and that's it.
Okay.
Right.
But interestingly, I went through
Hello.
the process.
Hello, lovely to encounter you in actual sound and vision. Marvellous.
We've just launched into a really fantastic conversation. We're in flow, definitely.
Well, we're talking about the need for a different approach to education, and how creativity is suppressed in much of the way we educate our children, about the ability of children actually to know what, know, as far as I'm concerned, children already know about natural inclusion. It's very obvious to them, and I remember knowing about natural inclusion as a child. It was very obvious to me. And then how we actually get narrowed down or beaten out of that basic kind of understanding. I was also going to mention that just this morning on Radio 4, on the Tibet Today programme, there was yet another really very moving interview with a parent of a child who had committed suicide because they were scared of taking their mock GCSEs. And that to me just says it all about, the cruelty to children. I often think that our educational system ought to be taken to the NSPCC for the extraordinary cruelty to children in terms of imposing particular standards and attitudes upon them. And my own deep feeling too, which has become intensified, is that I've always felt, a lot of people say natural inclusion, this is a very esoteric, very intellectual, very elitist way of thinking. And actually I've always felt, no, it's actually a very natural way of perceiving, which all of us are perfectly capable of, and all human beings are capable of, but we're somehow bludgeoned out of it. And that to me is kind of quite important. We've wandered all over the scene. We've got Rachel here who used to be in the RAF, and so has first-hand experience of what it's like to be in the middle of a war, and all those kinds of things. She's shown me the medals to prove it, and which I find rather wonderful in a curious way.
You haven't shown me your medal.
Yeah, I've got to show you my medal one day.
Yeah.
But that's another story. Anyway, so that just sort of fills you in as to where we got to. And where are you coming from? And how on earth did you let me get into print with you?
So, yeah. Well, actually, I think that maybe you can continue discussing, so we can jump in, like what you are commenting, if you agree, rather
Yes.
than starting from scratch.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And actually, I find very, very interesting this turn and the discussion is taken. So,
Great.
Shall we introduce?
So let's introduce each other.
Yes. Yes, good idea. Hello, I am Degard. Hello, finally.
And I'm Louie. So Louie Gardiner. So I did the review of Alan's book. Okay.
Sure. It's going to be published soon.
Yeah.
Good. Hi, I'm Rex.
Hi.
Hi, I'm Rachel.
Hi.
So of course here is Pina
Quite
and
people
Luca
sitting in the
from
corner.
Brazil right now, so there is a little difference in the time because it's in the morning here, and then well, we had some. We are lucky because the connection it's in work now. We have all the time a lot of problems in internet connection, but let us keep the finger crossed, and let us go. Yeah, and then we will jump in. We are so sorry because our schedule here in Brazil is literally absolutely crazy. So at a certain point we have to leave in about 20 minutes or half an hour. So sorry, we are waiting for connecting with you. We was waiting, but we have some trouble. But yeah, we are here, so we can try to follow up what you are saying. Okay?
Fantastic, thank you.
Thank you.
So who's going to start?
Oh, are we actually going to start
No,
with
no,
the...
no. I mean, I was just sort of filling in all. Are we going to sort of continue
I
where
think we
we
should
were?
continue. I think we got to an absolutely beautiful place where you're talking about educational foundation, we're talking about new language, we're discussing schools and the, as you say, the issues.
So maybe I could pick up the thread around the kids, because so in the work that I'm sharing and teaching, training people in, I have a number of people who actually work with children, and one of them is somebody who supports children and adolescents who are struggling at school, who have relationship issues, who are on the verge of being excluded.
Can I just ask, can you hear? Can you hear okay? Yes, okay, good.
And what she's been doing is drawing upon what she's been learning through me over the last 5 years. And we're going to be running a workshop in June. So with Children's Scotland is one of the bodies within Scotland that is looking to develop the work and opportunities for kids. So this person has begun to get a reputation within the area because the normal conventional institutions that offer responses to support kids are proving to be less effective. And so teachers from schools are beginning to divert the kids to her. So we're doing something to try and bring, to open up the space for teachers and for parents to get a better understanding of what we're doing. And interestingly, I'm also working with one-to-one with a deputy head teacher at one of the Edinburgh schools. And I've got another senior head teacher who is coming on a training that I run in September, because what they're realising is what I'm doing, and I'll give a caveat to that in relation to inclusion, is that they're realising that what we're doing is they can see how it will make a difference to kids. So I'm just anchoring that, and part of the reason that the thing that has come through me, what it does is honour the tangible and the intangible, and it provides a way in which all of those come together so that somebody comes to a place of coherence in themselves in relation to whatever's going on in their lives. And so that centering in, bringing together the tangible and the intangible, helping to reveal what has been current but not in view, changes everything. And people get those shifts in the moment. And so what we're actually trying to do is to bring that so that more people can get it for kids to get it, and to begin to find a way to do that.
There we are. The technological world, yes.
Great. Great.
Interrupted service.
I mean, I'd like to add education as well, because I have been, for the last 20 years, part-time, offering a program on how we manage complexity and uncertainty for senior managers in business. And I don't use any theory, I don't use any notes, and what I do is I throw them into an experience which is highly complex, utterly uncertain for everybody that's involved. And there is a considerable danger associated with it. So I include all of those aspects, and they have to effectively, people, and these are international students from all around the world, they have to plan and execute a day's sail on a 60-foot yacht without ever having sailed before. And there's 3 professionals to make sure that whatever they do is safe for them, and they have to plan and execute this. But what they don't understand is I am not at all interested in how well they do. The whole thing is being videoed, because what I'm interested in is how they really behave, what happens to them when they are thrown into a very complex and uncertain situation. The following day, what I ask them to do in order to begin to unpack this, so again, I'm not telling them anything, but I'm asking them to share their experience, is that they, within teams of 8, each boat has 8 people on it. Each team, one of them has to tell a story no longer than 5 minutes, taking the key element of the day that they learned, something that they learned from it, to transfer it into an entirely different situation and tell a story, no more than 5 minutes. The second person has to, because it's a business issue, so it has to have a business relationship, is to take one of the values of the company that they work for and write a poem about the experience in the light of that value, to demonstrate, again, they're compressing. And the last and the most challenging is one person has to, again, on behalf of the group, stand up and give a haiku. So only 3 lines, 7 syllables, explaining what they will take away and do within the next 6 months as a result of the exercise. And what's interesting is I am challenged by all of the other professors and teachers that I work with, because I don't tell them anything. And I need to have a script, and I need to give them handouts, and I don't. And yet at the end of it, I would say that about, at best, 20% of people understood what's gone on. 10% have an inkling that something that they didn't expect has gone on, and maybe 5 to 10% actually it changes their lives. And it's sort of very interesting, because I've done this now for 24 years, and last year was the first time I ever got a haiku out of the group, because it required, by doing it this way, it means I know what their experience is, I know that they can transfer learning from one situation to another, and I know, in a sense, how their world is shaped. But so you can imagine that they go out on a grey day when the weather's not necessarily good, and they have to sail a boat which is big and powerful as a group, and they've never done it before. So a lot of fear, a lot of anxiety, and they have to control it, they have to steer it, they have to take charge of everything. So the levels of anxiety are very high. But one person last year, out of all of these years, finally gave me, in a sense, the gold or the diamond in it all, because his haiku was fascinating. What he said was, the haiku was, elephant of grey, only a small plate, delicious. And I thought that was, it just floored me. And so it's very interesting that if you go away expecting everyone to learn from it, when you do offer something new, it's not going to happen. Because so many of them are so conditioned, they can't understand what is being said. but those one or two are worth every bit of it. And it's, I think this to me is another way where natural inclusionality takes place because there's nothing forced on them.
Yeah. And I think that really, that ties in that whole experiential. So in the trainings I do, I don't give any handouts. Everything we do is always what's present in the moment, what's showed up. So they're getting something in their bodies long before they have any capacity to talk about what it is that happened.
I certainly try. In fact, my first question is, when they come into the room, they're sat down there, okay, how are you feeling? And often nothing is said then. I said, okay, hands up those who are a little bit anxious about this. No hands go up. And I said, okay, you're all crazy, because I would be, and you should be, because that's exactly what happens when you're confronted by something so uncertain and complex that you're being given. But you deny the very thing that's going on within you. And I think this is, for me, the beginning of why people don't accept natural inclusionality and everything else, because it's just such a shock.
We were having a conversation yesterday around this very same subject of effectively the inner artist. So a person who embodies the artist in the sense of creating from, not being given an agenda, specific rules, versus the current trend in education, which is to tick boxes and arrive at an apparent impact, which we all hate, actually.
I remember there's sort of one of the difficulties I had when I was teaching at university, and I used to teach courses in an unusual way apparently, and the students sort of, every other lecturer would put their course notes on Moodle, so that the students could basically regurgitate what the course was, and they'd already know what was going to be said at the lectures. And I would never do this, and I used to get into quite a lot of trouble. And they said, well, why won't you put your course on Moodle, Alan? And I said, well, Moodle is for poodles. But the real truth was that I couldn't understand the technology. So I scared stiff of the technology, because but actually there's a lot to do with it, is that there is that sort of sense that somehow you should be, it's become an expectation within the educational system that you will be provided with all the answers that you can, and I finally got sick of it when students kept asking me, just saying to me, just tell me what I need to know to pass the exam. That wasn't the point of it at all. And it really was, that is not education, that is training. The real purpose of education, which is to enhance awareness and enhance curiosity, is completely flattened out. And in the end, I had to leave it because it was just becoming so depressing and difficult. But anyway, we sort of rambled on a bit on that.
I think back to your idea of, I think we're roaming around, again, back to the practical, of a society, or as you're saying, an educational foundation, something that we can put a pin in it and say there's this sort of formal meet where we can start to arrive at maybe it's just as simple as words which then people take away and play with, because I'm fascinated by this difference between concept and precept.
Percept.
Sorry,
Concept and percept, yes.
Percept as a percept, and therefore again back to this evaluation, analysis and data. if you were trying to write a piece or with the notion of percept, I can't even say with the notion of, can I?
Not
You say-
really, no, because that's a concept.
Yeah, that's a concept.
Yeah.
To start with these details, or like we're saying, state waves or flow form or free, to start to have. I mean, would it
I'm
be
still
awful?
troubled with this because it's
You're
back to this,
troubled.
because it's this same thing about language. And at the moment, what we're trying to put across to many people is very unfamiliar, and they're not familiar. And I still think we have to go through this stage of through embodying the experience and showing it to others. They begin to understand because
You are
quite-
one.
Yes,
and
no,
there's
no,
7
no.
billion people on the
no,
planet.
you're not one against that. You are one of that 7 million. You're not separate from it. You're
Not
part of it.
against, but
I know-
one of.
I know, but I'll give you an example. By accident, I was flying from Salzburg to London, and I talk to people when I'm travelling. And the guy next to me was the director of the World Orchestra for Peace, and the guy on the other side, this is in the cheap seats on a Ryanair, was Kofi Annan's speechwriter. And the director of the World Orchestra for Peace opened his computer and he had a manuscript on it. So I said, oh, that's interesting. It's interesting how soul can move your emotions. It can touch the soul. And this guy said, what a brilliant idea. So I said, have you ever engaged the audience in a conversation with the orchestra after you've played a piece to find out what changes? And he said, no, brilliant idea. We're playing in Salzburg. Do you think, could you organise it? Could you moderate it? And I said, yeah, not a problem. I didn't know what we can do. So he got up to get his computer. I turned to the other guy and said, do you know this chap? No, should I? And I said, well, we've just been talking about how music can change the emotion. What a great idea. I've got a castle in Salzburg, you could run it there. So on that flight from Salzburg to London, we organised the first dialogue between the World Orchestra of Peace and the audience, which took place the following day. And it was a complete knockout because all I did was to say to them the difference between a dialogue and a normal conversation you have.
Rex, I'm so sorry to interrupt you and say it's not all you did. You did.
No, sorry, no. Let's finish the story.
You
No,
were
because
there.
I know, but the point is that what I said to the people there
I know, it
was,
made a massive
whatever you do,
difference. Yes.
I don't want to know what you think. It's irrelevant to me, but I want to know how your feelings change, what emotions were present, what did they do. Now the orchestra said to me beforehand, Gurdjieff was there, and they said, oh, it's useless, he never talks. And then, so I told everyone how dialogue works, and then I said, Maestro, if you'd like to say something. An hour later, we had to tell him to stop to get on the plane because he had to fly somewhere else.
Fantastic.
And the whole place erupted, and this went on for several hours in a free-flowing dialogue. And at the end of it, they said it's the best thing that's ever happened. So I thought it'd be interesting if we have one next year. It never happened. And this is the whole point, I think, about what's going on here.
It's
Is that
catching those moments.
it's so powerful.
Yes,
And
yes.
the trouble is, it's also so overwhelming.
Yes.
Because, I mean, you know, they try and think, how do we organise this? And the answer is, well, it took me an hour and a half.
Yeah.
You know.
Yes.
It takes
And it's-
nothing to
yeah, exactly.
It was a
It's like
perfect
it's using
coming
what's
together.
present.
Yeah, but
In
this
the
is
moment.
natural
It's
inclusionality, I think, in
present.
But
Yes.
you say it's what's present, but you were on a flight. That there's a lot. I can't deny it. I can't deny the fact that there's the flight. There's the fact that you were in Salzburg in the first place. Somehow you paid for all of this. Somehow the WPO people, they spent thousands of human hours of endeavour to build this gigantic organisation, and the other person next to you, and there's a sort of perfect harmony, synchronicity, which is absolutely beautiful. But you weren't there.
But I think the synchronicity.
So what's the point?
My point is that we to the practical side. That's the point of. I agree that it's not about push and influence in that respect, and we want to create a different dynamic. There's something very beautiful in that. However, even if it's a matter of the five of us coming together and having some.
Let me just put it into, no, there's something I want to put it in a nutshell. I had no idea what I was going to do when I stepped on the plane. In the same way that whenever I go in and do a lecture or seminar, I have no idea until the minute I have to open my mouth.
Yes.
And in that moment, I know what it is.
I don't think that's
No,
the way
so
the rest
no.
of the world works.
I know, but the point is, this is sorry. But do you believe it could, and do you believe it should work that way?
Absolutely not. I want my trains to run on time.
So there's
That's why we're
There's
stuck.
That's the start point.
Yeah.
If you believe
It's-
that everything
there's-
would collapse because
No.
you see,
There's the material.
We've lost the
Oh.
mechanic.
Oh.
you see, I think synchronicity has an awful lot to do with it, and I think if you
Well,
are
that's what
I-
ready in
I-
each of those moments, it
Yeah.
will all.
So I think there's what the distinction we're making here is that in that example, and what happened was receptive, responsive presences,
Yeah.
all being receptive,
Inflow.
responsive presences in flow together, which made that possible. And what I'm doing in the chapter I was telling you about, what I'm doing in my thesis, and what I think more of us need to be doing is writing about those moments when they happen. Because it's not about all the things that led up to, because we can't ever know how to line those things up. All we can do is this bit, and if we can write about that, then people begin to get, so that's what receptive, responsive, present looks like in the moment.
It's interesting because
Right?
that's what
So
it feels like.
Yeah, it feels like, yes,
That's what it
but
feels like.
for
Yeah.
the people who haven't got it yet, they start to get, so we need to narrate that. And the other, so just the other bit, just to pick up Dee's bit, is that when we're talking about trains and planes and things happening on time, there is something about those things that we might want to control in that way, we know we can do.
Yeah.
But we know that's helping people to recognise that those are unusual circumstances beyond the way nature normally works. Which,
Yeah, I mean, I can give you.
and so it's not either or,
Yeah.
it's both and. When can we
Just
do
to
that
no,
bit,
just to
and
try
when
and answer
can we-
Degard, so I've turned around 4 companies from bankrupt, the worst in performing, into the highest performing and outperforming everybody else, and it's the same thing. I still have no, and when people say to me, how do you do it? The answer is, I have no idea. I just know that I talk to the cleaner in one hospital, it changes the entire hospital. And the consultant's arguing is saying, we're the most important people in the hospital, not them. And I said, sorry, wrong way round. They're far more important than you, because people see their work, and a scruffy hospital is not. So, what I'm saying is,
But that
but everybody in these
a
hospitals.
wonderful example,
I
wouldn't
don't know,
it,
but the point is, the trains
of
would run on
perfect.
time because the people are there because they want to be there and they enjoy what they're doing.
And they
They're not
recognise
doing
the
it for the
value
money.
of the
Yeah, exactly.
contribution.
Exactly. It turns it into a human construction, not a material one.
I want to go back a long way suddenly, and it's something that it keeps coming back to me, is the idea that natural inclusion is unfamiliar to most people. And I don't think it's at all unfamiliar.
No,
I think
I would agree with you.
No, I think you're right.
I think
Absolutely.
it's the fact
No,
that
no, no,
what
sorry.
happened with you
No,
is
no, no,
exactly
no.
that.
No,
that
sorry.
is
No,
that
no,
you were
no.
tapping into what was familiar.
Yes, I know,
What
but
they
the point,
knew.
the point
Yes.
is the language that was being used was not familiar.
Okay.
And
okay,
so I
yeah,
was
yeah.
utterly familiar, which is why I wanted to
Okay,
contact you.
yes, yes.
But, so in other words,
Which
I've lived
language-
it most of my
Which
life.
language was familiar, which was unfamiliar?
The language I use,
academic
yes,
language is, you know, marmalade and wheelbarrow is two long words.
Yeah,
I want small.
Yeah,
Yeah, you like the one I use
yeah,
there.
so natural inclusion is not unfamiliar to anyone.
Exactly.
However, we don't have enough narrative for
Yes,
people to anchor their known, lived, embodied experience and say, oh, I know that.
Yeah.
Is that
yeah.
all?
Can I make a comment? But please, I cannot see you anymore.
Oh, right.
Oh.
Can you switch off? Yes.
Oh.
No, but
Wrong one.
Yeah, the camera should be on.
yeah. That's on.
Okay.
Yes.
Yes. Here we are.
Here we are.
But here we are. Can you make a comment? Because this one thing right now has my attention, and I would just add a little more about this. Natural inclusionality as a tool for better understanding or for better educational commitment, I would say. This is a very general comment. When we enter into the scene, you were already there. You were talking about the connection between natural inclusionality and education. And then I was starting thinking and reflecting while listening to you. That is right. There is some kind of strange things that are going on in education at a very general level of analysis. And if you think about 6 years old children going into primary school, they have already a lot of experiences about the world around them. They did a lot of things. They know a lot already. They have a lot of fun and then a lot of great activities. But what happened into the school? The school is supposed to be a place for them to get a sort of formal education, very much organized in a specific course, mathematics or literature or whatever it is. But this kind of formal intervention, educational intervention, doesn't take sufficiently into account what they already know about the world. So what happens? This kind of flow of knowledge that exists already is somehow broken, is interrupted, and school enters as a sort of new kind of things. So this natural inclusionality doesn't exist. School doesn't take profit of the knowledge that is already there. So instead, schools should work in a more inclusive way, just build upon what is there. This will be possible, and this will also be a sort of new agenda for school, more in line with a sort of natural inclusionality of education. I don't know if you can get my points. But there is
Yeah.
So that school, instead of building or constructing new knowledge, is first doing a sort of deconstructive action. It's not building, but is destroying something which is already there.
Yes.
So we should rethink and reanalyze school's intervention from the very beginning in this way, looking at the destroying part, what school destroys, instead of what school constructs. Because this is the destroying part, nobody takes into account. It's really not easy, it's really, taking out something, And this, for our students coming into school and have to learn a lot of new things that are for him or her, not new at all. So students are treated as tabula rasa, while they are not. They know a lot, they have a sort of naive knowledge of things that could be the basis for new knowledge language built up. And we should, need to reflect a little upon this dynamic in terms of natural inclusionality, because this is, heuristically speaking, an interesting tool to develop further for our next,
And this is really important, and for me, I actually, the first chapter of the book that you managed to get published for me was called A Personal Experience of Culture Shock. And my primary culture shock was when I went to school for the first time, and I didn't actually go to school properly till I was about 8, because I was brought up in Africa, and I had all this experience in an African garden, and then all of a sudden I was transported over to Britain and put into the British education system, and everything that had thrown at me in this education system made no sense whatsoever in terms of my actual experience in an African garden. And that was a big shock to me, especially mathematics, especially arithmetic. I quite like the languages and the geography and that sort of thing, but mathematics, what the heck is this all about? Because it is not consistent with my experience. And of course, many years later, I know exactly why. Because mathematics is an abstraction, and based on a false separation between the material and the immaterial. And that, but as a school child, that was my first big shock. What is this? Why are you dividing all these figures up? You're cutting all these figures apart from their yeah.
And then just for continuing your comment, Alan, this is a very hot topic nowadays, because can you imagine the experiences into school for immigrant children?
Yeah.
And this is a big group nowadays coming into European schools. A lot of people are coming, and they need to adjust to our, way of educating in a certain way.
Yeah.
So it's really, really hard. So your cultural shock is what they are experiencing right now.
Yes.
So thousands and thousands of people around us.
Yes.
And so I think all these kind of things we are discussing in a very theoretical level of analysis and very sophisticated, has also some concrete social implication that we should take into account.
Yeah.
And also, Luca and I, in a complementary way, I would say that we are working with the indigenous people
Yes.
in several parts of South America, for instance, here in Brazil, but also in Chile, with Mapuche people, with Indian American people. They refer to a different cosmology.
Yeah.
So, well, it's absolutely different. So this is something that your, natural inclusionality concept would illuminate very much this kind of dynamic, in order to avoid a sort of epistemic injustice.
Yes.
Because otherwise, this is the risk. A sort of epistemic injustice, which means don't take into account what is there, and overimposing a sort of agenda that is from the top to down. It's it's something that is gone part of the
I think
this is something collectively.
I think sorry.
It's interesting that they say that there was, I've forgotten the author now, but they said there's 2 stages in life, and the first stage that society imposes on us today is to be something. And then when you're something, then the next stage is you struggle to find out who you are. And I think this actually is the problem of education, because we should never worry about being something, because that isolates us. But if we become who we are, then we are much more valuable to society, because we're a lot more fluid, creative, we are in the flow. I think this first stage of educating to be something is the problem.
And it was definitely the conflict that I experienced, and perhaps more acutely because of my background of a sort of you know, I was an immigrant, strangely enough, and I experienced the culture shock of being an immigrant, and actually, you know, I was kind of very well aware of African philosophy, just because most of the people I actually encountered in my young life were Africans. That was very interesting.
It's to start to think about embodying this from the theoretical to the practical. Me saying that word 1,000 times today, apologies. Would it be preferable to be purist and work entirely with the individual and their knowledge, and thereby not actually bring outside knowledge to the individual, in sense of if we created some small workshops as a way of realizing these ideas.
Well, I certainly actually did this during doing my Life, Environment and People course at Bath University for 11 years. That's exactly what I did. But it was very much about, it is bringing the two together, is what are your own views, what is your own experience, and how does this relate to what you've actually been taught? So actually I was asking the students to sort of really sort of look at what they've been taught in terms of their own experience, in terms of their personal experience. And for this reason, partly, you know, I had a struggle to keep the course going because my colleagues tried to stop me. I mean, they really did try to stop me doing it because they felt that they were being undermined and threatened, and that the whole of science was being brought into disrepute, which is what it was, of course. But there was that sort of,
but
you
that
know,
that wasn't your intention.
It wasn't my intention.
Your intention was to open people
Open
up
up
to themselves, each other, and the world.
Exactly.
And the consequence of that is others finding the disturbance
Yes.
as challenging their very shaky foundations that they themselves were working from.
And what's odd is it usually comes from, like for example with artists, the people who are most resistant to, say, my kind of work are the actual other artists, which would be the ones that you would think would be the least resistant.
Your competition, and you're
Yeah,
competing for a
quite.
set market, and that's why you're a problem.
Quite.
Instead of being open and saying, the people who prefer your work will go to you anyway, no matter what.
And as we've been discussing, I personally don't feel that competition. That's not what I'm up to. But those in it very much feel it.
So this wanted to make a point.
You want to come in?
Yeah, just a very short, very quick comment.
Please.
So I begin by apologizing because in few weeks, so we will not break the flow anymore. So at a certain point we will just I was particularly resonating to me Alan's comment on migration. Why? Because you could put it in this way. You could say that every child is a migrant child when it comes to school. So, to what extent the school is aware of this, to what extent the school is a device stimulating rather than a device for promoting or cultivating. Of course, when you have one to the epistemic injustice. The idea of epistemic injustice is the idea of the incapability that we have to acknowledge the other person as a legitimate subject of knowledge, producer of knowledge. So basically it's what we do with every child at school. We don't recognize him as a legitimate subject of knowledge. And he must become, and work hard to become, a legitimate subject. So in the case of actually migrant children, to this initial prejudice, you add another prejudice, which is the prejudice of not having, of having kind of initial deficits that comes from being a migrant. So you in this case you have a double injustice, epistemic injustice. And the third point is, what is the idea? The idea is that the child must change. There is no point in having a school which is supposed not to change students. It is an implicit assumption. So I think that actually, in all, if you put together all these aspects, you get a picture of education as a form of violence. Somehow. So what is at stake in this form of violence? And sometimes even I will mention again in British education, like a century ago or more or less, it was blatant form of violence. It was explicit, that you have to suffer. So I'm not sure that even today, I'm not sure that all these implicit assumptions are fully criticized and are fully explored. So just the last point is to close this difficult, in a certain sense, is I will problematize also when it comes to creativity issue. So what again, where this comes, to what extent this creativity is nothing but an additional skill that we want. So an additional way in which we want to change the children to become more creative, but I think it's kind of normative idea of creativity. So what because you already have in mind what the child must become, or how, in which direction must change, without taking into account where the child comes from in terms of her life trajectory and her peculiar life experience. So that's my comment. Sorry, a bit too long.
No, it's very important comment, and I think we're bound to discuss that quite a lot more as we go on during the afternoon, I would guess. And it's sort of interesting, the idea of non-violent education came to mind as you were talking about, and the notion of and this is how I experienced school. I did experience school as abusive and violent, as far as that was my experience of how I felt, and your expression is every child being a migrant within school. I think I certainly felt that, experienced that very intensely, and again that was the strange. If you look at what one particular student said about my life, environment, and people course, I mean, she said it was completely miraculous because it was the first course that had valued the student's view that she'd ever been to, which I thought was quite an indictment of the system that she'd been in, actually, that she could actually make that comment that first time she'd been to a course where the students' views were welcomed and the students' ability to educate one another was explored and valued, rather than being told, you know, from top down how they should be seeing things. So it was
this is very much, I think, the difference between arts and science again.
yeah.
Because in the arts, you have your view is the view, but it's also very violent, because again, we were discussing this yesterday, and I hope that everyone can listen to the conversation. It was focused on the Royal Society of Arts, but inevitably there were educators in the room, so this point came up. But what happened to me in art college was they said, find it, off you go. You just gotta dig it out yourself.